It was 4:18 p.m. in the historic heart of Milan. Amidst the sea of wealthy tourists, a makeshift sign stood by the dusty curb. Short task, $2 cash. Adrian Vale, a 42-year-old single dad with tired eyes and calloused hands, stared silently at the paper. He clutched a small bag of rusted tools, his worn jacket a stark contrast to the surrounding luxury. Suddenly, a sleek limousine stopped. Clara Moretti, the Billionaire CEO, stepped out. She looked at Adrian with icy contempt. $2, carry these boxes, she commanded. The crowd laughed, but Adrian did not react, until Clara looked straight into his eyes. Adrian Vale was once a name that carried the weight of empires, a man who navigated the treacherous waters of high finance like a seasoned captain steering through a hurricane. He was a brilliant engineer of markets, a visionary who saw patterns where others saw chaos, and for a brief shining decade, the world was at his feet. But that life was now nothing more than a ghost, a haunting memory of a man who no longer existed in the eyes of the elite. 10 years ago, a devastating internal scandal stripped him of his title, his reputation, and every cent he had ever earned. He had been cast out not for his failures, but for his integrity, becoming a sacrificial lamb for a board of directors that preferred profit over truth. He didn't fight back when the walls came crumbling down, because his heart was occupied by a far greater, much more painful battle. His wife, the anchor of his soul, was fighting a terminal illness that slowly stole her breath and her strength. In those final months, Adrian didn't care about stock prices, hostile takeovers, or board seats. He cared only about the warmth of her hand and the uncertain future of their newborn daughter, Lily. When she passed, the world went cold and gray, leaving Adrian alone with a child to raise and a name that had been dragged through the deepest mud. Since then, Adrian's only priority has been his little girl. He became a shadow living on the outskirts of Milan, taking odd jobs, fixing broken appliances, and laboring in silence just to keep a roof over their heads. He lives in a small, cramped apartment where the walls are thin enough to hear the neighbors' arguments and the pipes groan in the middle of the night. Yet his love for Lily is a fortress that protects her from the harsh, biting reality of their poverty. To Lily, he isn't a fallen titan. He is just Daddy, the man who tells the best stories about stars and make-believe kingdoms, and the man who makes even a simple bowl of watery soup feel like a grand feast. But today, the reality was grimmer than usual. The rent was 2 weeks overdue, the landlord had been banging on the door with threats of eviction, and the pantry was completely empty. Adrian had walked 5 miles into the central square, his shoes worn so thin he could feel every pebble on the pavement, hoping for any work that would provide even a few coins for milk. In the center of the square, the atmosphere was a universe away from Adrian's daily struggle. Clara Moretti was launching her new luxury product line, a grand event filled with flowing champagne, expensive silk dresses, and the heavy, intoxicating scent of overwhelming wealth. Her logistics team was in a state of frantic, high-pitched panic, searching for cheap temporary labor to move last-minute shipments of heavy display materials that the union workers had refused to touch. Clara, a woman who valued efficiency above all else and regarded emotions as a business weakness, watched the scene with a cold, detached gaze. To her, the people standing in line for the $2 task were not human beings with stories, dreams, or families. They were merely tools to be used and discarded once the job was done. When Adrian stepped forward to take the job, his posture remained strangely straight, unlike the other broken men in the queue, who stood with slumped shoulders and defeated gazes. There was a quiet, unshakable dignity in the way he stood, a residue of the man he used to be. He accepted the $2 offer without a single word of complaint or a plea for more. He wasn't doing it for the money itself, but for the minutes it bought him. Those $2 meant a fresh gallon of milk and a small, colorful treat for Lily when she woke up from her nap. As he hoisted the first massive crate onto his shoulder, the heavy wood bit deep into his skin, sending a jolt of pain through his spine. But he didn't flinch. He moved with a disciplined grace that seemed entirely out of place in such a desperate setting. The event staff whispered and pointed, making cruel jokes about the fallen gentleman who was now a pack mule for a woman half his age. One staff member even tossed a coin near his feet just to see if he would scramble for it. Adrian ignored the stings of their insults, just as he ignored the physical pain in his back. He had learned long ago that pride is a luxury the poor cannot afford, and silence is the best shield against the ignorant. Under the scorching Milanese sun, he moved more crates than 3 younger men combined, his eyes fixed firmly on the pavement, never once looking up at the glamorous world he had once called home. The humiliation only intensified as the afternoon sun reached its peak and the VIP guests began to arrive in their glittering attire, stepping off private buses and out of luxury cars. One of Clara's junior executives, a man named Marco, who was eager to impress his boss with his own perceived superiority, began to mock Adrian's meticulous way of working. Marco stood with a glass of vintage champagne in one hand, pointing a manicured finger at the man in the worn jacket. "Look at this one," Marco laughed loudly, ensuring his voice carried over the ambient music to where Clara was standing. "He organizes the crates by weight and serial number as if he's managing a global warehouse. He looks way too overqualified for a $2 job. Perhaps we should hire him to organize your shoe collection, Clara? He looks like he needs the exercise." The crowd of sycophants erupted into snickering. Clara heard the remark, but she didn't intervene or even look toward the source of the laughter. She simply sipped her sparkling water, her eyes scanning the square, watching the man in the dirty jacket move with an eerie, almost mechanical precision. There was something about the way he handled the logistics, something about the fluid flow of his movements, that triggered a distant, nagging memory in the back of her mind. A memory of a boardroom from a decade ago. Adrian continued his work, ignoring the laughter that rippled through the VIP section. He began to rearrange the entire storage area in a way that maximized flow and efficiency, a subconscious habit of a man who once managed billion-dollar systems with the flick of a fountain pen. Suddenly, a sharp electric crack echoed through the square, followed by a collective gasp from the crowd and the smell of ozone. The massive digital display screen, the multi-million-dollar centerpiece of the entire launch, flickered violently, turned a sickening shade of neon green, and then went pitch black. Panic erupted among the technicians. They scrambled toward the control booth, their voices high and frantic as they checked cables and reset servers. The system was custom-made, highly complex, and the celebrity guests were already stepping onto the red carpet, their faces reflecting the confusion of the sudden blackout. If the screen didn't work, the launch would be a public relations disaster, and Clara's stock price would likely plummet before the markets opened the next morning. Clara's face turned into a mask of pure, unadulterated fury. She marched toward the technical crew, her heels clicking like gunshots on the stage. "Fix it, now, or none of you will ever work in this industry again," she hissed, her voice a sharp blade of ice. But the technicians were lost. They stared at the monitors, sweating through their expensive shirts, unable to find the source of the catastrophic failure. They were looking at the software, but the problem was deeper. Adrian, standing near the crates, glanced at the main control panel for just a fraction of a second. From 30 feet away, he saw the specific blinking pattern of a tiny red light on the secondary circuit. He knew exactly what had happened. It wasn't a software bug. It was a classic thermal overload caused by a poorly calibrated visual transition between high-resolution files. He almost walked away. He had his $2 in his pocket, and this was no longer his world. Why should he help the woman who looked at him like he was dirt beneath her designer heels? Why should he save the empire that had been built on his own destruction? But the instinct of a master engineer, the part of him that hated to see a beautiful, complex system broken, was too strong to completely ignore. He stepped toward the panel, his voice low but carrying a strange, undeniable weight that seemed to cut through the noise of the panic. He muttered almost to himself, but loud enough for those nearby to hear. "The circuit is overloaded. The heatsink can't handle the visual transition between the high-res files. You're trying to force too much power through the secondary relay. You need to bypass it manually." Clara, who was standing just 5 feet away, caught the sound of his voice. It wasn't just the words he used. It was the tone. It was the unmistakable voice of authority, the voice of a man who was used to being the smartest person in any room he entered. She turned around, her eyes narrowing as she truly looked at him for the first time. She saw the structure of his jaw, the steady, unflinching depth of his eyes, and a cold shiver ran down her spine. The mockery from her staff died down as they realized their CEO was suddenly staring at the common laborer with an expression of pure bewilderment. "You!" she said, her voice trembling slightly with a mixture of confusion and a rising, terrifying recognition. "Step into the light. Put that box down and look up at me. Right now." Adrian slowly straightened his back, the heavy crates no longer on his shoulders. He wiped the sweat and grime from his forehead with a grease-stained sleeve and looked directly into the eyes of the most powerful woman in Italy. The silence that followed was deafening. The bustling square seemed to fall into a vacuum as Clara's hand went to her mouth, her eyes widening in a mixture of shock and absolute terror. She wasn't looking at a $2 worker anymore. She was looking at a legend she thought she had buried in the archives of history a long time ago. Clara didn't just see a laborer with tired eyes. She saw a ghost from her own past, a man whose portrait used to hang in the main gallery of the firm she had aggressively acquired a decade ago. 10 years ago, Clara Moretti had made her name and cemented her billionaire status by executing a ruthless, hostile takeover of Vail Industries. She remembered the brilliant co-founder, the man who was the heart and soul of that company, who had disappeared into thin air after a massive internal fraud scandal broke just weeks before the merger. Everyone in the financial world had assumed he fled with the money. Everyone had assumed he was the villain who had abandoned his employees to save himself. She reached deep into her memory and pulled out a name that she hadn't spoken in years, a name that felt like lead on her tongue. "Adrian. Adrian Vail? Is that really you?" The crowd gasped, the sound rippling through the square like a wave. The name Adrian Vail still carried immense weight in the older, more established circles of Milan. It was the name of a fallen titan, a man once thought to be a criminal mastermind who had betrayed his own employees. Marco, the executive who had been mocking him just moments ago, felt the color drain from his face, his champagne glass nearly slipping from his shaking hand. Adrian didn't look away, and he didn't show the shame she expected to see. His gaze was calm, steady, and devoid of the bitterness that should have consumed him after a decade of misery. "I am here for the $2, Miss Moretti," he said, his voice echoing with a haunting clarity. "I believe I have 2 boxes left to move before my task is complete and I can return to my daughter." Clara was breathless, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. She ignored the cameras, the celebrity guests, and the frantic whispers of her staff. She stepped closer to him, her expensive heels clicking on the rough pavement. "Why are you here, Adrian? Why are you doing this? You were the brightest mind in the entire industry. You were a king of the markets." Adrian's response was simple, cutting through the glamour of the event like a surgeon's knife through silk. "Because life changes, Clara, and milk for my daughter costs more than my pride is worth. A king without a kingdom is still a father who needs to provide. I learned that there is more honor in moving boxes for $2 than in stealing millions from the people who trust you." As the world watched, Clara's internal walls began to crumble. She had spent years building her empire on the ruins of his, believing the narrative that he was the one who had cheated the system and stolen from the shareholders. But looking at him now, seeing the absolute, unshakable dignity in his poverty, she felt a sudden, sharp, and terrifying doubt about the history she had been told. She turned to her assistant, her voice a sharp, urgent hiss. "Get the audit files from the 2014 acquisition, the encrypted ones, the ones my predecessor told me were lost. Now, do not make me ask twice." The assistant scrambled, and within minutes, a digital file was pulled up on a high-security tablet. Clara scrolled through the confidential notes, her face growing paler with every second, her eyes darting across the lines of old data and suppressed emails. The records hidden deep within the archives of the merger confirmed the first part of the double twist. The scandal that had destroyed Adrian wasn't his fault. It was a calculated, cold-blooded frame-up orchestrated by a senior board member named Silvio, a man Clara had later promoted to her own executive team because of his efficiency. But then she saw the second twist, the one that broke her heart and made her knees feel weak. The documents showed that Adrian had actually known about the frame-up at the time. He had the evidence to clear his name, but he chose not to use it. Why? Because Silvio had discovered that Adrian's wife was in a secret, high-cost experimental medical trial. Silvio had threatened to use his influence to cut off the funding for that trial if Adrian fought the charges. Adrian had traded his reputation, his wealth, and his entire future just to give his dying wife 3 more months of painless life and the chance to hold her daughter one last time. He had walked away into the shadows to be a husband, while the world branded him a thief and a coward. Clara realized that her entire career, her entire reputation as a self-made billionaire, had been built on a foundation of lies and the suffering of an innocent man. She had unknowingly participated in the systematic destruction of a man who was more honorable than anyone she had ever met in a boardroom. Adrian saw the realization dawning on her face. He saw the tears beginning to well in the eyes of the woman who was known for never crying in public. He didn't smile, and he didn't gloat. He simply stood there, a $2 laborer who was richer in spirit than everyone else in the square combined. "I didn't come back for revenge, Clara," he said softly, his voice barely a whisper. "I just wanted to survive for my daughter. I wanted her to know her father was a man who stayed, not a man who ran." Clara looked at the $2 coins she had intended to throw at his feet, and for the first time in her life, she felt the true, crushing weight of her own cruelty and the hollow emptiness of her golden tower. She had everything, yet standing before this man, she felt like she had nothing at all. Clara didn't hesitate for another second. She walked to the center of the grand stage, took the microphone from the startled announcer, and silenced the music that had begun to play for the arriving guests. The entire square fell into a heavy, expectant silence as the billionaire CEO, the woman who usually spoke only of profit margins and global expansion, pointed toward Adrian. He was still standing there in his tattered jacket, his hands stained with the dust of the crates he had been hired to move. "This man is not a laborer," she announced, her voice echoing with a power that shook the very air. "This is Adrian Vale, the man who built the very foundations of the company I lead today. He is the man who taught this industry what it truly means to have vision and integrity." In front of the world's media, her investors, and her stunned staff, Clara publicly apologized. She admitted, with a trembling but determined voice, that he had been a victim of corporate greed and that she had been blind to the truth for far too long. She revealed the truth about the frame-up and the blackmail, effectively ending the career of the board member who had orchestrated the lie. Silvio, who was watching the live stream from his office, knew his life was over before the speech even ended. The event staff, who had spent the last hour mocking Adrian, were suddenly paralyzed with a cold, sickening fear. They avoided his gaze, realizing they had been bullying a man of far greater character and history than themselves. Clara stepped off the stage and walked through the crowd, which parted for her like the Red Sea. She stood before Adrian, and in a gesture that shocked every person watching, she offered him a position as the chief strategy officer of her global empire, effective immediately, with a salary that would make him one of the wealthiest men in the country once again. The crowd held its breath, expecting him to jump at the chance, to grab the wealth, the bespoke suits, and the power that had been stolen from him so many years ago. It was the ultimate Cinderella moment for the business world. But Adrian simply shook his head. He looked at the expensive contract she was mentally offering, and in his mind, he saw only the long nights in the office, the missed bedtimes, and the precious hours he would lose with Lily. He had already lived that life, and he knew exactly what it cost in the end. "I don't want your position, Clara. I don't want the fame, and I certainly don't want the power," he said softly, his voice carrying more authority than her own ever could. "I have found something much more valuable in the silence of these last 10 years. I have found peace." "Then what do you want? Please tell me how I can fix this," Clara asked, her voice desperate, searching for any way to clear her conscience and make amends for a decade of injustice. Adrian looked around the square, at the other men still waiting for their $2 tasks, their faces etched with the same exhaustion he had felt that morning. "I want justice for the others," he replied. I want you to open a full, independent investigation into every person who was unfairly terminated or sidelined during your acquisitions. I want their names cleared, and I want them compensated fairly. I want you to remember that behind every resource you manage, there is a human heart with a family waiting at home. Clara agreed instantly, her eyes bright with a new kind of purpose. She pledged, right then and there, to reform the company's core values, putting people and transparency above the quarterly profit margins. The atmosphere in the square shifted from one of mockery to profound, silent respect. Clara reached into her pocket and pulled out the original contract Adrian had signed for the $2 task. She tore it into 1,000 pieces and replaced it with a handwritten promise of a full investigation and a massive fund for the displaced workers. Adrian took his $2 from the table, not as a payment for his labor, but as a reminder of the day he regained his name without ever having to lose his soul. Adrian Vale did not return to the high-rise offices of Milan or the world of tailored suits and private jets. He had discovered a different kind of wealth in the quiet, humble years of fatherhood, a wealth that no stock market crash or corporate betrayal could ever touch. He accepted a modest, stable position as a consultant for a nonprofit organization that helped families in crisis, a job that allowed him to use his brilliant mind for good while ensuring he was home every single afternoon to pick Lily up from school. He didn't need the billions anymore. He only needed the look of pride and the bright smile in his daughter's eyes when he walked through the door. Clara Moretti kept her word. She transformed her empire into a global model of ethical business, rooting out the corruption that had once fueled her aggressive growth. She became a different kind of CEO, one who valued the person as much as the profit, and her company became more successful than ever because of it. The story of the $2 billionaire spread like wildfire through the corporate world, serving as a chilling warning to the arrogant and a glimmer of hope for the downtrodden. It reminded everyone that status is temporary, but character is eternal. Adrian still walks through that same historic square in Milan, but he is no longer invisible to the world. People nod with a deep, silent respect as he passes, sensing the quiet strength of a man who could not be broken by poverty or pride. He kept that original $2 in a small, simple frame on his desk, a trophy more precious than any business award he had ever won in his previous life. It was proof that dignity is the only currency that never devalues, no matter how hard the world tries to spend it. Clara often seeks his advice, not on financial mergers or market trends, but on matters of character and leadership. She learned that the best hire she ever made, the one that truly saved her company's soul, was the one she thought was worth the least. As the sun sets over the golden spires of Milan, Adrian stands with Lily, watching the light dance on the ancient stones. He is no longer the man with nothing left to lose. He is the man who has everything that truly matters. If you believe dignity outlasts status, type, "I will live kindly." If stories like this stay with you, subscribe to Chip Healing Stories. We tell the ones that shouldn't be forgotten.